She grabbed my wrist at my own son's rehearsal dinner and told me, in front of 40 people, that I was embarrassing her family. That was the moment I knew, not the moment I acted, but the moment I knew exactly what kind of woman my son had chosen to spend his life with. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years building a plumbing and HVAC contracting business in Winnipeg from nothing but a second-hand van and a license I passed on my third try, and I have never in my life raised my hand to anyone. Not once. Not even when I had every reason to. My son. I'll call him my son because that's what he is. Whatever else he's become is 34. He met his wife 4 years ago at some rooftop event in the Exchange District. She's from a family in North Vancouver. Her father runs an import business. Her mother doesn't work, which is fine. I don't judge. But her mother also has opinions about everything and the manners to match. The first time I met them, over dinner at High's on Fort Street, the father spent 40 minutes talking about their vacation property in the Okanagan and asked me exactly 0 questions about my life. I drove home that night with a bad feeling I decided to ignore. My son was happy. That was what I told myself. He was happy, and she was, well, she was sharp, clever, organized. She had a way of walking into a room that made people pay attention. I respected that, even when it made me uneasy. Even when I started noticing the way she corrected my son in public. The way she'd say, "We've actually decided," instead of asking. Small things. The kind of things you tell yourself don't matter. They got engaged in December. My son called me from Vancouver, where they were visiting her parents, and he sounded genuinely happy. And I was genuinely happy for him. We talked for 40 minutes. It was one of the best conversations we'd had in years. The trouble started in February, about 8 weeks after the engagement, when my daughter-in-law, and I'll call her that because technically she is, even now, when she called me directly to discuss the wedding budget. I want to be clear about something. I offered. Nobody twisted my arm. My son had mentioned they were looking at venues, and I said, without being asked, that I wanted to contribute. I meant something reasonable. $10,000, maybe $15,000, a meaningful gift from a father who wanted to see his son have a proper celebration. What I did not anticipate was being handed a spreadsheet. She emailed it to me the following Monday. Color-coded, itemized. The venue alone was a ballroom at the Fort Garry Hotel. The catering was $220 a head. There were 240 guests on the list, a number I later discovered had been rounded down from 260 because she wanted to keep it intimate. The flowers, the photographer, the videographer, a second videographer for candid coverage, a photo booth, a jazz quartet for cocktail hour, and a DJ for the reception. A hair and makeup team that was flying in from Toronto. The total she had put together came to $114,000. I sat at my kitchen table in St. James for a long time looking at that spreadsheet. I called my son. He sounded uncomfortable right away, the way he sounds when he already knows what I'm going to say and has already decided I'm wrong. He said her parents were contributing as well. I asked how much. He said they were covering the honeymoon and the rehearsal dinner. I did the math in my head. The honeymoon they had chosen was a 10-day trip to Japan. I happened to know this because she had mentioned it in passing, enthusiastically, as if I would share her enthusiasm. Even being generous, her parents' total contribution was somewhere around $22,000. She was asking me to carry the remaining $92,000. I am not a poor man. After 31 years, the business was worth something real when I sold it in 2021. I have a paid-off house in St. Morne, James, a modest RRSP, and enough in a non-registered account to live comfortably without touching CPP until I'm 70. But I am not a man who wastes money. I never have been. My son grew up in a house where we took care of things, where we didn't spend where we didn't have, where you looked at the price before you put something in the cart. I told my son I would contribute $60,000. That was my final number. I thought it was generous. It was more than I had ever planned to give. He went quiet for a moment and then said he would talk to her. She called me back herself within the hour. She did not call to negotiate. She called to explain to me, in a tone that I can only describe as patient, in the way that a person is patient with someone they consider slow, that the wedding they had planned was a reflection of the life they intended to build. That 60,000 was a starting point, not a ceiling. That her parents had expectations about the kind of event this should be. That if I loved my son, I would understand. I said I did love my son, and that loving him was exactly why I was being responsible with money that I intended to eventually leave to him. The line went quiet for a few seconds. Then she said, "We'll make it work." I should have understood what that meant. What it meant was that over the following 4 months, small additional requests arrived. A gift contribution toward their first condo, costs that had been underestimated in the original spreadsheet. The rehearsal dinner, which her parents were hosting, turned out to be at Missay on Sherbrooke, not a potluck in someone's backyard. And a portion of those costs somehow landed with me as well. By the time the wedding week arrived, I had spent just under $89,000. I had told no one. I didn't want to embarrass my son. The rehearsal dinner was a Thursday evening in late June. The weather in Winnipeg had been hot all week, that particular kind of summer heat that sits on the city like a lid. I wore the blazer my son had specifically asked me to wear. I drove myself. I arrived 7 minutes before the stated start time and was told by a server that the private dining room wasn't quite ready. I waited at the bar. I ordered sparkling water. I was standing there when she came over to me. She was in a dress I didn't recognize, not the rehearsal outfit her mother had mentioned, and she looked, honestly, stunning. That's the word. Whatever else I think of her, she is a beautiful woman, and she knew exactly how to carry herself. She walked up to me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and said, very quietly, "I need you to not bring up the cottage tonight." I didn't know what she was talking about. I had mentioned 2 months earlier, in a private phone call with my son, that I'd been thinking of possibly buying a small place on Lake of the Woods for summers. A personal thought, nothing to do with her. She had apparently heard about it, decided it was relevant to the wedding financial conversation, and constructed a story in her head that I was somehow withholding money from the wedding to buy property for myself. I told her calmly that I had no intention of discussing any of that and that I wasn't sure why she'd brought it up. She tightened her grip on my wrist, not enough to hurt, enough to feel like a warning. "You know what I mean," she said. I looked down at her hand. I looked back up at her. I said, "I think you should let go." She did. She smiled again and went to greet other guests, and I stood there at that bar with my sparkling water, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger exactly, more like the feeling of a diagnosis you suspected but hadn't yet confirmed. The wedding was Saturday. I will not go through all of it. The ceremony itself was beautiful. I'll say that honestly. The Fort Garry ballroom looked extraordinary. The jazz quartet was worth every dollar. My son cried when he saw her come down the aisle, and I cried watching him, because that is still my son, and there is no version of this story where I don't love him. The trouble happened during cocktail hour. I was standing near the east windows with a glass of wine, talking to my brother and his wife, who had driven up from Brandon for the weekend. My brother has known me for 62 years. He is the person I trust most in the world. We were talking about nothing in particular. His daughter's new job, the drive up, whether it would storm before midnight. When my daughter-in-law appeared, she was not smiling this time. She had something in her hand, a small card, hotel key size. She held it between two fingers, extended toward me, and said, "I need the keys to the River Heights property." My brother and his wife went quiet. The River Heights property is a duplex I have owned since 1998. I rent the upper unit and use the lower unit periodically when I need to be on the south side of the city. It is worth, by current Winnipeg market assessments, somewhere around $640,000. My son had mentioned at some point that he and his wife were hoping to eventually have more space. I had never, in any conversation, ever offered or implied I would transfer that property to them. I said, "This isn't the time." She said, "It's the right time. Everyone's here. You can make an announcement." I looked at my brother. His face had gone completely still. I said, "I'm not making any announcements about property at your wedding." She stepped closer. She was still holding that card out, like I was supposed to take it and understand the symbol of it, the demand embedded in the gesture. She said, "You've been stringing us along for months. You promised that property would be ours when you sold the business." My husband told me. I want to pause here because this is important. I never said that. I never said anything close to that. I had at one point told my son that the duplex was part of my estate and that he was in my will. That is not a promise of transfer. That is a father telling his son he hasn't been forgotten. I said, "I never promised you anything." She said, "Then you've been lying to my husband." And then I am still, even now, sitting with the fact of it. She slapped me. Not a glancing thing, not an accident. An open-handed slap across my left cheek, deliberate and hard enough that my wine glass tilted and a woman behind me said, "Oh my God," loud enough that heads turned across the room. There were 180 people in that cocktail area, 180 people who witnessed my son's wife strike me across the face at her own wedding. I did not react. I want to be precise about this. I did not yell, I did not reach out, I did not stumble, I did not cry. I stood completely still for about 3 seconds, and then I set my wine glass on the nearest surface and I walked outside. The air outside the Fort Garry on Broadway is different from the air inside. It was a warm evening, the kind Winnipeg gets in late June where the sky holds light until almost 10, and there were people on the sidewalk and cars moving on Broadway, and the city was completely indifferent to what had just happened to me in that ballroom. I called my solicitor. His name is not important, and I will not use it. I have worked with him for 19 years, since before my son finished high school. I reached his voicemail and I left a message that was approximately 40 seconds long and entirely calm. I told him what had happened, where I was, and that I needed to speak with him first thing Monday morning. I told him I would be making changes. Then I called the property management company that handles the River Heights duplex. I left a similar message. Then I called my financial advisor at Investors Group on Portage and left a third. I went back inside. My son found me near the bar. He looked frightened, which I had not expected and which honestly hurt more than the slap had. He said, "Dad, I'm so sorry. She was stressed. You know how much pressure." I said, "Don't." He said, "She didn't mean." I said, "Don't." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Why do you always have to make things so hard?" That was when I understood that this was not a surprise to him. The entitlement, the card, the demand in public, none of it was a surprise to my son. He had known what kind of woman he was marrying, and he had decided long before Saturday that managing me was easier than challenging her. I was not his father in that moment. I was an obstacle he was tired of working around. I said, "Enjoy your reception. I'll call you next week." I drove home to St. James. I poured a small glass of Scotch Glenfarclas, a bottle I'd been saving for nothing in particular, and I sat in the backyard until it was dark. The neighbors had their sprinkler on. A kid somewhere down the block was chasing something with too much energy for 10 o'clock at night. Ordinary life carrying on. I did not sleep much. I don't think that needs explanation. Monday morning, I was in my solicitor's office on St. Mary Avenue by 8:15. I had written out, longhand, everything I wanted to discuss. We spoke for 2 hours. I want to be clear that what I did was legal, considered, and in no way impulsive. I did not act in anger. I acted from a position of complete clarity that had been building, honestly, for about 2 years, and that my daughter-in-law's behavior on Saturday had simply finished forming. The River Heights duplex was removed from my will entirely. My son had been named as primary beneficiary of my estate. He was replaced. I restructured the estate to direct the primary assets to 2 things: a scholarship fund in my late wife's name at the University of Manitoba, and a charitable remainder trust directing the balance to the Siloam mission, which my wife supported for 12 years before she died. My son is still in the will. He receives, under the restructured document, my personal vehicle, the contents of my workshop, and a lump sum of $50,000, which is, I'll note, more than I received from my own father, who died with debts and an apology. I also contacted the Fort Garry and canceled the hospitality suite I had booked and paid for her parents' 3-night stay. That refund, as it happened, was processed in full because I had taken out the event insurance the hotel recommended when I booked it. I had done that automatically, the way a man who spent 30 years running a business does things, habitually, without drama. I did not call my son that week, or the next. He called me on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after the wedding. The call lasted 6 minutes. He said his wife wanted to apologize. I said I would think about whether I wanted to receive that apology. He said things had been very stressful. I said I understood that planning a large event was stressful. He said I understood that planning a large event was stressful. He said I wasn't being fair. I said I thought I was being very fair, and that he should talk to a lawyer before making any assumptions about the estate, because the document had changed. That was the first time in the conversation that he went quiet in a way that wasn't just a pause. He said, "What do you mean it changed?" I said, "It means what it means. Speak to a lawyer. I hope you're both well. Good night. I don't take pleasure in this. I want to say that plainly. I am 67 years old, and I have a backyard and a workshop, and a shelf of books I haven't read yet, and enough money to live carefully and well for the rest of my life. I am not lonely in the way people might assume. My brother calls twice a week. I've 2 friends I've known since before any of us were married. I fish when the season is right. What I have lost is the assumption that my son and I would grow old in some kind of parallel warmth. Sunday dinners eventually, grandchildren maybe, the ordinary closeness I had taken for granted as something that simply comes with time. He made a choice. I don't use that word to wound him. It is just accurate. He chose in that moment outside the bar when he asked me why I always had to make things so hard, and that choice told me everything I needed to know about the next 20 years. I uncapped the pen in my solicitor's office, and I signed the new document, and I drove home through downtown Winnipeg on a clear Monday morning in July, past the forks and the river and the ordinary city that has held me for 31 years. And I thought, I have never been more at peace with the decision I wished I didn't have to make. The inheritance my daughter-in-law came for is now funding university for students who couldn't otherwise afford it. I think my wife would have found that very satisfying.